Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. We are expecting quite a few attendees, so we're going to get started immediately. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to our webinar on the American Rescue Plan Final Rule Updates for Water, Wastewater, and Stormwater projects. My name is Tess Clark from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center, and in a moment, I'll turn things over to Elsa Marie Mullins, Project Director at the University of North Carolina Environmental Finance Center. But first, there are a few logistics to keep in mind during this webinar. First, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. Therefore, please use the GoToWebinar question dialog box to ask questions and submit comments or thoughts. You can do this anytime throughout the session. We will be certain to save time for questions at the end. You will be receiving a follow-up email that includes a link to all the materials and any other information that you might need for today. A PDF of the presentation is also available under the Handouts tab of your GoToWebinar control panel, and you can download that at any time. This training has not been pre-approved for any kind of PDH or CEU credit. However, we will provide certificates as a courtesy. We can't guarantee that a training will receive pre-approval or that this training will meet any specific requirements, but please be sure to attend the entire session, and you must be registered and using your real name and a unique email address. We will be emailing certificates of attendance directly within 30 days. And there's an email address where you can get in touch with us if you have questions. Now for a little bit about us. Through training and technical assistance services, the Environmental Finance Center helps water and wastewater systems achieve their goals and stay in compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. And please be aware that there's free technical assistance services available to small water and wastewater systems through this program. Here you can see a couple of our centers that make up our network, and you can see that there's various partner organizations across the country for this year's programming. We work together to provide solutions to difficult how-to-pay issues of environmental protection and improvement. Okay, and on that note, I'd love to turn it over to our speakers from the University of North Carolina, Elsa Marie Mullins, and Kimberly Kirkart.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So thanks, Tess, for getting us started, introducing the EFCN. I wanted to introduce myself a little bit too. I'm a project director at the University of North Carolina Environmental Finance Center. I've been doing a lot of work tracking the effects of COVID on utilities, and part of that is tracking the money that's coming because of COVID to utilities. So not just ARPA, but also a slew of other things. But today we're going to be focused on the American Rescue Plan Act and specifically state and local fiscal recovery funds. I enjoy doing technical assistance, as Tess mentioned, with systems one-on-one, so you can reach out directly to me or fill out the form, the link that she's put in the chat. And I also really enjoyed the applied research side of my job, where I get to ask kind of big picture questions and play with data. Kimberly joined us last year, and she's been a research assistant, also tracking kind of the money from COVID that's been coming down, and she'll be giving part of this presentation as well. But like we said, we want to have plenty of time for questions, so we're going to jump right in. The first thing we'd like to know, now that you know a little bit about us, is what we would like to know a little bit about you. Please select what kind of staff or person you are. We'd love to get a little bit of a feel of who's on this webinar.
Awesome, and it looks like we have about 50% of people participating. We'd love to get your thoughts here, so I'm going to leave this open for about 5 more seconds in the spirit of moving forward quickly. So last chance to participate. I am closing this poll in 3, 2, 1. And here's your results. Looks like there's quite a few different types of people on today.
Yeah, thank you. I saw from the registration there were a bunch of folks registered from regulatory agencies and some consultants. And so I think you'll find this information helpful for you as well, and then be able to disseminate that information to the small systems that you work with in your state. The next poll is, we'd love to hear a little bit about where you stand with American Rescue Plan Act dollars, specifically local fiscal recovery funds.
Yeah, so this one is a little bit of more of a thinking question. So take a minute, well, take 30 seconds to think about it and let us know which of these options best reflects your current understanding. Looks like folks are moving through this pretty quickly, so we will close this in just a few seconds. Let's say 5 more seconds. So I'll close this poll in 3, 2, and 1. And again, a lot of different, all over the map here.
Okay, yeah, I see the majority has some idea of how to use them and still has some questions, and then another 20, 25, 22% is really curious about the final rule changes, which is great because the final rule really has changed a bit of, especially how I see kind of the approach that you might use for your local fiscal recovery funds. But before we get into all of that, we'll go through the kind of the basic timeline of what has happened. So these are, what we're talking about today is the American Rescue Plan Act, and specifically the state and local fiscal recovery funds. So they were first designated in March of 21, so about a year ago. Since then, Treasury has put out a lot of different documents for guidance, but most notably the interim final rule, the FAQs associated with that interim final rule. And then in January, at the beginning of January, they released the final rule, and they took into account a lot of the comments and questions on the interim final rule and responded to them as part of the final rule. That kind of yellow star is where we are right now, which is right before the interim final rule and the interim final rule FAQs expire at the end of March. So we're kind of in this period right now where you can still be operating under the interim final rule, but come at the end of March, you'll need to have switched to the final rule. So we're going to be focused on the final rule today. April 1st is when that final rule is effective and binding. And then 30 days later, April 30th is the first reporting deadline for non-entitlement units, which are our systems that are our units of government that are smaller. And I'll get into exactly what that is too. We also have on here the deadlines of December 31st, 2024, which is when all the fiscal recovery funds must be obligated, which means they're signed over, you know how they're going to be spent, and they're already in the hands of that subrecipient or contractor. And December 31st, 2026, all the funds must be expended. All right, so now that we've seen kind of the timeline of where things are, I'm going to talk a little bit about this in-between phase when the final rule is not in effect until April 1st, but you can start following it now. You'll see the kind of increased flexibility. We're going to go over that in this presentation. And if you've already done something based on what was in the interim final rule, that's okay, because the interim final rule was the guidance and they're not going to get their money back. You are not subject to recoupment if you've done things under the interim final rule so far. However, in starting April 1st, it is the final rule. So when in doubt, especially now when we're getting so close to that April 1st deadline, follow the final rule. So a little bit intro of how the money is distributed. It's going to states, direct recipients, and indirect recipients. So for the state governments, in all of these cases, water and wastewater may be one of the uses of these funds, but probably not all of them. So especially at the state level, maybe even at the county and the city level, and at your town level, water and wastewater projects is just one part of many potential uses. And because the audience of this webinar is for small systems, I'm going to be speaking most to those non-entitlement units, those indirect recipients that receive their money through a state agency. So you didn't get it directly from the Treasury, and your reporting requirements and some of your other considerations are unique to the smaller systems. So we're gonna be focusing on that because this is a small systems webinar. One thing to note is that special authorities, districts, governmental units that provide water or wastewater services but are not part of a local government unit at large, so town, village, city, whatever, are not recipients of these local fiscal recovery funds. However, they can act as subrecipients for the local fiscal recovery funds And so in that way, you can still potentially get some of these funds, but you have to talk to your local officials and your local units of government in order to receive those funds. So for the purpose of today, we're going to be mostly talking to those indirect recipients, those NEUs. So what can local fiscal recovery funds be used for? I'm going to go over the 4 broad categories, and this is under the interim final rule. COVID response and adaptation, 2 subcategories: to respond to the public health emergency and address negative economic impacts. The other category is premium pay, and then replacing public sector revenue loss, and then water, sewer, broadband infrastructure investment. For the purposes of explaining kind of how the final rule has changed things, I'm going to be making some really broad generalizations, and I know that. So just keep that in mind as I go through the next couple slides, because I really want to kind of focus on how things have changed from us talking about eligible projects under the water, sewer, broadband infrastructure category to the replacing revenue loss category. So first off, as many small towns and non-entitlement units across the US receive their funds, they're looking at these categories. All their funds must be spent in these 4 categories and for projects that fit in just one of these categories. So each use of these funds have to fit in one category. So as you look through the list, the first one for COVID impacts and the economic impacts, there were phrases like disproportionately impacted population and qualified census tract. And that first category could be helpful if you wanted to spend some of your money on PPE or vaccine related expenses. But if you're looking at negative economic impacts, then you have to kind of figure out how this is going to work under the interim final rule. And it was rather complicated. So I'm going to say it's just a bit much. And the premium pay, there are similar difficulties. Maybe there wasn't much of an expense for premium pay for essential workers. And maybe it's hard to define and defend the essential workers label. And so it might be hard to spend your funds in that category. Moving on, the revenue loss category, it had a calculation that was pretty difficult to calculate, and a lot of utilities and a lot of units didn't actually see a loss in revenue. So if they did see a loss, they could put those local fiscal recovery funds into the general fund and use them for general government services, which is the most broad category. However, many units didn't actually see a loss. And if they did, then it probably wasn't all that much in some cases. Again, I'm making large generalizations. So the last category for water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure investment was relatively more straightforward compared to the other ones. There's a clear need for investment in infrastructure all across the country, and it'd be pretty easy for an NEU to use all of their local fiscal recovery funds on a water, wastewater, or stormwater project, or many of those projects. And so although the project still needed to fit within the SRF guidelines, that's still a lot of projects and it's pretty broad. So many units were looking to use their local fiscal recovery funds in this category under our guidance from the interim final rule, which is great. We definitely need to invest in water and wastewater infrastructure. However, things have changed with the final rule. So it's still great to invest in water, wastewater infrastructure, but here's what's changed. So for the first 2 categories, there are some details and definitions that make it easier to understand the guidelines, which is fantastic. For the last category, water, sewer, broadband infrastructure, there's more flexibility, and Kimberly's going to go over that later. But the biggest change is that where the infrastructure category used to be kind of the easiest way to spend your money for the reasons I've explained, now units can use a standard allowance to replace public sector revenue loss. So that means where that water infrastructure was the easy category, now you can use up to 10 million of your local fiscal recovery funds in the revenue loss category. And that category includes all general government services. So this category is now clearly the most broad use and pretty attractive to spend your dollars in. And it includes all of those water, wastewater, stormwater projects that would have been in the other category. It includes so much more in addition to those things. So let's go over a couple of the main things to know about this category, and we'll go over the infrastructure category changes too. But because this is now kind of the easiest way to spend that money, that's 10 million or fewer dollars, then it kind of turns into the easiest category. So, and you can still spend it on water, wastewater infrastructure projects. And I'll go into some of these kind of nuances. So in this category, there are two options. You can either use the default lost revenue growth, which is that 10 million standard allowance, or you can use the modified formula to calculate out and see if you have over 10 million in lost revenue. The formula is pretty complicated, and we're talking to small systems here, so we're just going to assume that you all want to use the standard allowance because you have probably 10 million or less. And once you choose that option, you have to stick with that option through the course of 2026. So if we're going to assume you're going with the standard allowance, it's pretty great because you can just check a box and say, I'm using the standard allowance. You don't actually need to have lost any revenue. You can use up to 10 million of your local fiscal recovery funds. You can spend it for any general government services. You can put it in the general fund or the enterprise fund and then use it from there. You don't have the Davis-Bacon or other requirements that are attached to this money. It can just be used for, just be used kind of as general or enterprise funds. And this is a very important difference from the interim final rule, is that your standard allowance can be used as a match for SRF grants and other federal grant programs. And this wasn't allowed in the interim final rule. So if you're applying for an SRF, drinking water or clean water SRF grant through your state agency, you can use the local fiscal recovery funds as match for that and for a lot of other federal grant programs. So that is wonderful to know. And that's for the standard allowance. So that sounds pretty great. It sounds like that's just free money. You can use all of it as your standard allowance and then go from there, which is not really all that easy. So there are still some things to take into consideration, even though the standard allowance is by far the easiest way to use your local fiscal recovery funds. One is that the award terms in the U.S. Treasury and the uniform guidance still apply for any of the categories that you use it, even if it's revenue loss and you take the standard allowance that doesn't have other requirements on it, it still has these requirements. So you still need to follow the uniform guidance, which is the federal rules for procurement, internal policies, all of that. And you need to adopt several policies in order to do that. So we'll go in a little bit more into that next, but you also need to follow your own state law authority. So I'm in North Carolina. A unit needs to not only see what's eligible under ARPA as an allowable expense, but they also need to make sure that the state law gives them authority to do so. So one clear example in North Carolina is that cities and towns don't have authority to provide broadband infrastructure, but counties do. So even though ARP says you can use the money for broadband, cities and towns can't because state law authority restricts that. So make sure wherever you are, you know what your state laws are, and you could spend it under that authority. You still have to follow allowable costs and reporting requirements. Using the standard allowance for salaries is kind of like one of the a little bit trickier things in terms of raises. And there are some other complexities as well that we can't get into right now. So that being said, even though standard allowance is still the easiest, there are still strings attached that you need to consider. Under the uniform guidance, there are several policies that you have to adopt, and this is true regardless of how you use the money. So I'm going to go over some of these things. For any category, you have to use the eligible use, allowable cost, non-discrimination, records retention, conflict of interest, and financial management and internal controls policies. I've linked here to a blog by a colleague of mine at the School of Government at UNC, and there is so much more in the blog, including links to all of these sample policies. So if you had not had a chance to draft this policy or adopt it yet, I'd highly recommend you check out this blog and then follow the links to each of these policies, and kind of describes each of these policies. And there's actually a blog on a lot of these policies as well that you can link to from the main blog. It's important to note these are just sample policies, and they must be tailored to your unit and reviewed by your local attorney. But it's good to know they're out there. So regardless of how you spend your money, these are policies that you need to look at. Now, there are some policies that are only triggered by certain expenditures, especially capital projects. So this is where the rubber meets the road when you're thinking about doing water, wastewater, stormwater projects, even if you use the standard allowance. So this is going to be true whether you use it in the standard allowance or the revenue loss category or the water, wastewater infrastructure investment category. The program income policy would probably apply when you're doing expansion projects, but we're not sure yet. We're still waiting on some clarification there. It's complex, but bottom line is if you do a project where you get money from that project, so you charge a fee for water, wastewater services and you get money from that, that's program income. It might count as program income. And if it does count as program income, then it'll have to be paid back to the Treasury through 2026, but not beyond that. So still waiting for some clarification on that particularly, but something to keep in mind. The procurement and policy would be true for any capital projects. So you have to follow the federal procurement guidelines. And the property management policy would kick into effect if you're going to dispose of any property, or and this is really where we've seen it is where, say, a county wants to use some of their local fiscal recovery funds to extend a water sewer line out to, say, a community college run by the county, and then they're planning to turn that water line over to the local water system. In order to make that transfer of property, you would have to follow the uniform guidance and this property management policy, and then potentially a sub-award as well. And all of these policies are in that blog again. So, and this is true whether you're in, like I said, whether the revenue loss or the infrastructure investment categories. So as you're thinking about how to spend your money, and whether you're a finance officer at a town, you're thinking about all of these different general government services, or you're from a small system and you're thinking, how in the world can I spend this money on this really needed rehab project that people have already said they're in support of, especially with these extra complications. I just want to recommend to you to think about ways to maximize your benefit from local fiscal recovery funds while minimizing the administrative burdens. So you can use revenue replacement ARP dollars as standard allowance to cover allowable costs for government services that trigger fewer compliance requirements, such as salaries and benefits of government employees. Those are pretty easy to spend the standard allowance on. And that would free up general fund or enterprise money to be spent on more complex projects and programs. That, for example, some capital projects that would trigger several of these other policies, if you just use your general fund or enterprise funds, it wouldn't be triggered by that. But if you use ARPA funds, it would, because it's federal dollars. So, and also good to keep in mind that local fiscal recovery funds can also be used for administration of those funds. So thinking about ways that you can maybe use the money in a way that maximizes your benefit and then minimizes that kind of administrative burden that is currently on small systems, which at this point we might get more guidance from Treasury, so it's not necessarily the final word, but this is what we know right now. So with the final rule, again, these are the 4 categories, and we've talked a lot about the revenue loss category because that became the most broad category, kind of the easiest way to spend it, given the final rule. But Kimberly is going to give us an expanded, an overview of the expanded flexibility of the funds that you could use in the water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure investment, some of which are very key and we've gotten a lot of questions about. So go ahead, Kimberly.
Hi everyone, so now we'll just go a little bit into the water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure category and what's changed within the final rule. So the interim final rule pointed to the EPA's drinking water and clean water state revolving fund programs for project eligibility, and all of these projects are still eligible, but now the final rule has provided expanded eligibility beyond the state revolving fund guidance. So also when using funds for eligible water, wastewater, or stormwater infrastructure projects, there is now no need to obtain pre-approval from US Treasury. So here are just some of the highlights that we pulled from the eligible projects within the state revolving fund when the interim final rule was in place. So again, all of these are still eligible, but now we just have more flexibility within the final rule. So on the clean water side, this included construction of publicly owned treatment works, projects for pollution management, decentralized wastewater treatment systems, managing and treating stormwater, water conservation measures and management plans, and watershed projects. And then on the drinking water side, projects had to improve drinking water quality, but that also included projects that implemented transmission and distribution improvements, new sources to replace contaminated drinking water or to increase drought resilience. Green infrastructure projects were also eligible, as well as storage of drinking water, purchase of water systems, and connecting water systems and new community water systems. So now the final rule expands eligibility to include additional projects related to stormwater, residential wells, lead remediation, and dams, as long as they're found to be necessary, which is by meeting the following criteria. They must respond to an identified need to achieve or maintain adequate minimum level of service, which may include a reasonable projection of increased need due to population growth. And the project must be a cost-effective means for meeting that need, which takes into account any available alternatives. And for any investments in infrastructure that supply drinking water to meet projected population growth, the project must be sustainable over its useful life. So if your expanded infrastructure includes, for example, a new pump, which could have a projected life for around 20 years or so, you'd want to make sure in 20 years when it comes to replace that pump that there's been enough revenue generated from that expansion to replace it down the line. So the changes and additional eligibility that came under the final rule include flexibility within stormwater, residential wells, lead remediation, and on the next slide we'll go over the dam and reservoir remediation and drinking water infrastructure. So for stormwater projects, all projects are now eligible regardless of their water quality benefit. So that opens up a lot of flexibility for projects since the water quality benefit is now no longer a requirement. So this could include culvert repair, resizing and removal, replacement of storm sewers, and any other additional types of stormwater infrastructure. And for residential wells, this includes projects for infrastructure that improve access to safe drinking water for individuals that are served by residential wells. So this could be for testing initiatives, treatment and remediation strategies, remediation strategies that address contamination. And then for lead remediation, these projects are eligible regardless of the current pipe material, but the full length of the service line must be replaced, not just a portion of it. So also projects are eligible regardless of who owns the property where the service line is located. And this also includes lead testing, installation of corrosion control treatment, as well as water quality testing, compliance monitoring, and other remediation activities. It also includes replacement of internal plumbing and faucets and fixtures in schools and childcare facilities. So now we'll go over the expanded eligibility for dam and reservoir remediation and drinking water infrastructure. So to be eligible, the primary purpose of the dam or reservoir project has to be for drinking water supply, but it may take into account reasonable population growth. Also, stream and habitat restoration projects are eligible when the project implements a non-point source management pollution program plan, a national estuary program comprehensive conservation and management plan, and there also has to be a water quality benefit for this category. And for drinking water infrastructure, this is needed in order to support an increase in population, and it must be designed to support reasonable growth and not more. It has to be a cost-effective solution in order to achieve the minimum level of service, and it must be sustainable over its estimated useful life. So going back to the pump example, if it's projected to be replaced in 20 years, there should be enough revenue generated in order for that replacement to be done.
Awesome. Thank you, Kimberly, for kind of taking us through what has changed in that infrastructure and category for infrastructure investment for water, wastewater, stormwater. And we're going to go through a couple of final considerations before we get to your questions. Feel free to put them in the chat at any time. I know they've already been in the chat a lot, so, or not in the chat, in the question box. Feel free to put them in the question box anytime. So some final considerations as you're thinking about where to spend this money or where to encourage your small governments in your state to spend it. Yep.
I don't think the slides are up anymore. They disappeared.
Oh, can you see it now?
Yes, you're good.
Yep.
Thank you. So this is true for all categories. Reminder of what is not eligible. So debt payments or refinancing a loan is not eligible, even if it's an SRF loan. You can use it to match, but not to refinance or to make debt payments. You can't contribute to reserves, replenish your rainy day fund, or contribute to pensions. Something that was added also is that you may not use it to undermine or discourage compliance with CDC guidance. And it can't be used in a way that violates any state or federal laws and regulations, including the uniform guidance. So it's important to know that the UG still applies, even if, yeah, there are a lot of policies to follow and things to keep track of. Something else to keep in mind is that check out your state's allocation and how your state allocated your state fiscal recovery funds, because they may have gone to some projects or programs where you can receive some extra funds. So for example, in North Carolina, the state legislature designated a lot of the state fiscal recovery funds for the Division of Water Infrastructure to distribute through the SRF program. So there's an expanded pot of money for folks that are applying for drinking water, clean water SRF, and there's going to be starting up a stormwater, some kind of stormwater support system. Unclear exactly what that looks like yet in North Carolina, but I'd recommend you ask your state's SRF staff if they received additional allocations, because then you might know how to kind of pair what you're thinking about doing with potentially more money for SRF projects. And this is also really important, that you want to think about the long-term plan as you're thinking about how these specific funds need to be spent by 2026. So your project should be financially sustainable going forward. Kimberly kind of mentioned this, but you don't want to pay for something that in 20 years you're not going to be able to replace. So keep kind of the long-term view in mind, and not only replace something, but to be able to operate it and sustain it through its lifetime. More grant money may not come. Now there is the bipartisan infrastructure law, and that money is making its way down. But that may not be around in the 30 years that your infrastructure piece is going to last. So keep that in mind. There might be some regionalization or partnership options, kind of making a connection to a new system, or repairing some, kind of going in with another system to repair a wastewater treatment plant and expand its capacity, or things that you might be able to do with the investment now that will lead ultimately to a more sustainable future for your small system in the decades to come. And look at your rates. As federal funding has decreased on infrastructure since the mid-70s, and although ARPA and the infrastructure law is kind of putting more dollars in, it may not be sustainable like going forward. We don't know what federal dollars will be available even in 5 years. So think about how you can generate the revenue needed in order to sustain your infrastructure now and going into the future. Additionally, the EFCN can help you prioritize those needs as you're thinking about that, as you're exploring partnership options, or whether or not you need to raise your rates in order to maintain your infrastructure and your services going forward. That and many other topics listed here. With our network of 10 centers, we can kind of speak to a lot of different issues that small systems face. So Tess put the technical assistance request in the chat, and feel free to use that. You can also, if you're at a state agency, point small systems to us or another service provider to help them think through some of these things before they spend their dollars. So we're going to do the last poll, which is just, would you like to contact us regarding assistance? We're happy to reach out to you in order to do that. So, and if you think not now, I have to figure some things out, feel free to choose that second option, and we'll kind of set a reminder in a couple of months and contact you then.
Great. Well, I will leave this open for a few more seconds, but I know we're all eager to get to the questions. So take another second to submit a response if you'd like to, and we'll move on. Okay, I've closed that poll out for the time being. Are you folks ready for questions?
I'm going to do one more plug, just a couple other policies and resources from the U.S. Treasury and then also from the School of Government here at UNC, those sample policies. And we have a whole website with documents to share and stuff. I would love to know if anyone in your state has heard of other people doing similar work to my colleague, Kara Malanzi at the School of Government, in creating these policies, interpreting the uniform guidance, particularly for small units of governments who are trying to deal with this when they don't have the administrative strength as a large city. So if you know of anyone who's doing this kind of work, we would love to compare notes and hear about the other policies that were created, or talk about these things, because so far we haven't found somebody. So if you know of someone, feel free to email me. My email's on the screen now. And with that, we can go to questions.
Great. Well, first I want to thank both of you for your hard work putting this together. Clearly it resonates with folks because we're getting a ton of questions. Before we get to that, please note a lot of you asked for the presentation. You can download it now. It's under the handout section on your GoToWebinar panel, and it will also be sent out in a follow-up email if you neglect to download it today. But I definitely recommend getting your hands on it now so you can review it ASAP. Great. Okay, so our first question, tribal systems are also small systems. Could you share any considerations related to ARP for tribes?
Yeah, I don't know all the details of how things differ, but I will say the same is true in terms of you can still take the standard allowance, that 10 million, to spend it as the easiest category, and that's true regardless of if it's state, federal, or tribal fiscal recovery funds. As a direct recipient, tribal systems will have a higher reporting requirement, so I would say it might be worth hiring a grant administrator or just looking to partner with other systems that have the same reporting burden, but maybe not the administrative staff to handle it on your own, because you can use these funds in order to pay someone to help you report as well. And I'm sure there's a lot more detail we could go into, but that's kind of off the top of my head.
Great. Okay. And can you explain what kind of help these funds can provide to customers with account arrearages?
Yes, so that is going to depend a bit on your state law authority. So in some states, there's a lot more broad authority in order for a local government in order to help customers that have arrearages. So these funds, especially in the revenue replacement category, can be used for that, just like your general funds might be used for that. So in North Carolina, I know general funds can be used for assisting customers that meet certain criteria, low income and senior citizen. In other states, that criteria is different. So I can try to we did a report in 2017 looking at the pathways for navigating the legal pathways for customer assistance programs. And it's really a state by state issue. So in terms of the category of using the funds from the revenue replacement category, it's really flexible on the ARP side. It's just a matter of your state authority. And I'll find that and put it in the chat.
That sounds great. Okay, and so then next, can these funds be used to complete audits or a water loss audit or any type of auditing?
Yes, those are eligible under both the SRF criteria and under the revenue replacement category.
Fantastic. Do you have any idea why not-for-profit systems were excluded from being eligible for funding?
I think it's just because it went to all the units of government. That's how they decided to distribute it. So they weren't really thinking about it in terms of water wastewater providers as much as just any local government unit.
And similarly, does that have any impact on whether private systems or not are eligible?
Can you say that again?
Yes. Sorry, this question came a little later, but it basically asks about if there's an impact for private systems, small private systems.
I would say only where the government is only where your local government is willing to use their funds to support the nonprofit system, the small system. So unfortunately, that's kind of the channel these local fiscal recovery funds came down through, was through the local governments. Now, maybe your state has a expanded program because of ARP funds from the state fiscal recovery funds. So it'd be something to ask your state about as well. But there's no funds directly to those nonprofits.
Great. Okay. You noted that ARPA funds cannot be used for contributions to reserves or debt service payments. If the ARPA funds are used in eligible ways and that replaces the need to use other revenues for those purposes, can those other revenues be used for debt service or contributions to reserves?
Yes. So if you use say you use all of your allocation to pay your salaries for your government staff, and then you use general fund for your or enterprise fund for your debt service, those are still just normal enterprise and fund dollars that you can use for debt service, just as if you had raised them with rates. It just happens to be that they're more available because you could use ARPA for the salaries.
Okay, and on the same vein, this other question asks, I understand the funds cannot be used to pay existing debt. A local government will allow a utility district to be a subrecipient, but on reimbursement basis, can the utility take on interim financing to pay for the project during the reimbursement delay, and that interest be an eligible expense under the Treasury guidelines? Long one, sorry.
Sorry, can you read the second half of it again?
Yes. Can the utility take on interim financing to pay for the project during the reimbursement delay, and that interest be an eligible expense under the Treasury guidelines?
I think it would still kind of fall under the debt repayment, is my guess. It would fall under the debt repayment kind of category of not eligible. It might also be something that is up to the financer of that kind of bridge loan that they would be getting. So yeah, that's my best shot at that one.
Okay, yeah, we can always come back to some of these. And folks, we did get quite a few questions, so we're doing our best to select ones that were asked several times, but we can get back in touch with you. So don't worry if you don't see a response to your question. I think we can make sure we follow up in some way, shape, or kind. Okay. Can you explain the difference of disbursement directly to NEUs and competitive grant ARPA awards? Sorry, I'm not quite sure what they're what.
Yeah, I'm not sure. The ARPA funds went to the states, like a state agency, and that state agency distributed it to the NEUs. And then it went directly to counties, tribal governments, and large cities and states.
Great.
I have another question test that I'm happy to jump in on too. Someone said that they plan to use the ARPA dollars to dredge the sludge out of their sewer lagoon. They asked, can we claim the standard allowance and use that for the project? This person's the only person in the office hoping to reduce burdens. And so yes, the answer is yes. You can use a standard allowance to do water, wastewater infrastructure projects, including dredging a lagoon, and claim the standard allowance, which would decrease your reporting. You would still need, I don't think this would count as a capital project because you're not building anything under the uniform guidance. But it would be good to check that. But yes, using the standard allowance could potentially reduce your reporting requirement.
Great. We did get a couple questions related to special districts and how you would maybe advise a special district to go about applying for funds, whether they need to partner up with the local government or whether they're competing with local governments.
No, there's no competition in terms of the local fiscal recovery funds. So you'd have to partner, you'd have to ask the local government unit if they would be willing to support a project that you have. So that city or county, that would be there. If the state uses some of their fiscal recovery funds for a competitive grant project process, then you would be competing for it. But that's state by state, and you'd have to check with your state staff.
Okay, fantastic. I am seeing quite a few questions, or at least a few questions that related to lead line replacement. And I'm wondering if you would maybe just recap what types of remediation you anticipate these funds being used for.
Yeah, well, I'll let Kimberly speak to particular lead replacement things, but I will say any of those services would fall under general government services, so you could definitely use the standard allowance for it. So if you're going to do the revenue loss in the standard allowance category, you can absolutely use them in whatever way for lead remediation. But I'll let her talk about the water wastewater category.
Yeah, so I saw a question about lead remediation, including establishing an inventory of lead service lines. I wasn't sure if that would be eligible, Elsemaria. I'm leaning towards no, but I want to know what you thought.
I think I think it would be, because inventories and planning grants are usually part of the SRF eligibility. So it'd be good to double check on that one. But again, it would definitely be valid under the standard allowance category.
Great. For revenue loss, sorry, jumping back a little bit to revenue loss, the $10 million amount for that, does that also apply to state allocated ARPA funds?
Yes. So a state can take 10 million of their state fiscal recovery funds and use it as a standard allowance.
Great. And can the money to replace public sector revenue loss, same vein here, also be spent on operating costs, or does it need to be spent on capital projects?
Sorry, can you say the first part of that again?
Can the money to replace public sector revenue loss be spent on operating costs?
Yes. Yep. It can be spent on anything you would normally spend money on. So that's the standard allowance revenue loss category.
Awesome. All right.
And in some cases, the operating costs are going to be easier to report on and easier to comply with the uniform guidance than the capital projects.
Awesome. We're getting a couple questions about specific projects that this money might be able to be used for. So can you comment on if any of this money can be used for things like water meters? And then secondly, can it be used for things like manhole mapping for a sewer system?
Yes. So both of those things, definitely the first, and I think the second would be eligible under the infrastructure category, but they're definitely both general government services, so they'd be eligible under the revenue loss category and standard allowance.
Awesome. And then for folks, for other questions about specific projects, we may not have time to get to them, but we can definitely try to follow up with folks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, moving forward. Can you talk a little bit about the anticipated timeline for reimbursement of funds?
Well, so the first disbursement of funds was started last May, and then you'll get your second tranche this year sometime. So for the smaller units, depends on your state and how fast your state agency kind of distributed those. But I know in North Carolina, I think all of them were distributed by the end of August. So it just depends on your state. That's not reimbursement, that's just disbursement of the funds. So I'm not sure what they're referring to in terms of reimbursement, but that's the timeline.
And also kind of on the theme of timeline, can the funds be used for projects that have already been completed?
Yes, but only for expenses that occurred after, I think it's March 3rd, 2021. So if the project if those expenses were just incurred like basically in the last year, you can use the funds for that. And keep in mind, as an NEU, this April, the report that's due at the end of April is the first expenditure report. So if you haven't spent them, that's totally fine. You can just say you haven't spent them yet. And if you spent them on something, you can always like reimburse yourself and say you spent them kind of differently because you haven't reported to Treasury kind of how you've spent them yet. So yes, you can spend them on a project that's already done as long as the expenditures were after March of last year.
Fantastic. And then a final kind of comment about timeline. Do you know if there's been any discussion about extending the project completion deadline to increase potential qualified projects, and especially pending leftover unawarded funds?
Yeah, that is a great question. The timeline is really fast for these funds, for everything to be done by 2026. I know that's been something that people have asked about. I don't think that it will happen because I think the opportunity to do that would have been it for the final rule. You know, who knows exactly what will happen? I don't. But I would say it's safest to operate under the assumption that they will be gone by 2026. Now, if you use them for revenue replacement, it's likely you can use them, you know, before that for like salaries or other things, and then have more funds going beyond 2026 than you would have otherwise, even if they're not actually the allocated federal dollars. I saw another question about Davis-Bacon. Someone wanted to clarify that Davis-Bacon does not apply for ARP-funded capital projects. It does not unless it's over 10 million. Then there are similar requirements that are basically Davis-Bacon, but not exactly. Or if you use the funds for a project that's funded by other federal dollars, so if you are doing a project and you use both ARP funds and other funds, and those other funds have the Davis-Bacon requirement, then the project has that requirement. So ARP funds by themselves don't have it, but if they're used with another project, they do. And that's under the water wastewater infrastructure category, not as revenue replacement. If it's revenue replacement, revenue loss replacement, that's standard allowance, then there's no requirements. It's just like general fund dollars. And there's a second part of the question that soft costs associated with design, administration, contract, inspection of capital projects are eligible ARP expenses. That you have to kind of look at the details of the SRF handbooks under the infrastructure category. A lot of times planning grants and those things are included in the costs, are included in eligible projects. So that might be caveated, but if you use it under the revenue loss and the standard allowance, they're absolutely eligible because that's part of doing the project and your general government services. And that's most of these, a lot of these questions are going to kind of follow that, or these answers are going to follow that theme test of with a specific thing, there might be some details you have to look at for the water wastewater infrastructure category, but would probably be allowable under the general government services standard allowance revenue loss category. So if you hear me saying those things over and over, that's why.
How about, do you know if, so for communities that might engage in some shared services, can one community that applies for ARPA funds then send those funds to an adjoining community that supplies them with sewer service potentially?
Right, so you can't apply for the local fiscal recovery funds. They're just given to you by the Treasury. And you can partner with another organization, including another local government or authority or special district or whomever, to use these funds for something like a sewer project. Under the revenue loss category, you can absolutely do it as part of your general government services. Under the water wastewater infrastructure category, there might be some other requirements, like I talked about with property management and monitoring the subrecipient of those dollars as a subrecipient, and that might be true depending on how you use them with the standard allowance as well. So with partnerships, you just want to make sure you're looking at the subrecipient requirements, which are pretty rigorous reporting in terms of keeping track of how your subrecipient is using those dollars, as well as how you're using those dollars and making sure they're in compliance and you're in compliance, but you are allowed to use them for partnerships.
Okay, and then I am seeing a few questions related to the uniform policies. Do towns need to have those policies similarly adopted and on file in order to be in order to receive the funds?
Not to receive the funds, you probably already received them, but to spend them and to report on them, yes, you'll need to have those policies. There's one slide I showed that had all the policies you had to, that were kind of true that you needed to adopt regardless, but then other policies that are triggered by certain expenditures.
Okay, great. And then lastly, not lastly, there's still plenty of questions. This is another question on timeline, but I think it's a good one. Can the funds be used for projects that have already been awarded but not yet started? Our understanding is that there are specific bid advertising requirements with respect to language.
Yes, that is a great question. And whoever asked that is on point. There are bid and procurement requirements for capital projects. So if you have started the process and you didn't follow those guidance, those compliance needs for procurement and bidding and that sort of thing, then you can't use ARPA dollars for it. So any ARPA dollars have to follow the uniform guidance, whether, whenever you bid them out, they needed to follow it in order to use the ARPA guidance. Kind of along those lines, there's one question that's, what's the simplest reporting option? Well, we don't know exactly yet because we're waiting to see if the Treasury changes anything before the end of April when that first report is due. But as it stands now, the simplest option is to take that standard allowance of 10 million or up to 10 million, and then to spend it on things that don't take much administrative burden. So one example is salaries. Reimbursing for base salaries and benefits is fairly straightforward compared to some other things. So I'd give that as like the simplest reporting option. But we're kind of waiting to see. And I'd recommend you follow the blog that we sent and put in the link, because that will be updated. And Kara Malanzi has been very adamant about trying to make it clear what's kind of the simplest things for the small units of government.
Fantastic. And it looks like there's still some questions about the mechanisms by which funds would be paid back, or if they're or not paid back, depending on if there's unused portions.
The funds will have to be paid back after December 31st, 2026 if they're not spent, as things stand right now. They won't have to be paid back for interim final rule. If you use them under the interim final rule or the final rule, then you're not subject to recoupment.
Great. We just got a request to provide a link to the uniform guidance. If someone could toss that in the chat, I think that would be clarifying for folks. And then another timeline question: do the time constraints still apply to the standard allowance?
Yes, they still apply to the standard allowance. But what's nice is that the standard allowance is so flexible, it might be easier to spend that money by 2026 than it was before the final rule.
And then also sort of related to this, but more on the match side, oh, it just went away. For match for SRF grants, so on your slides it states that this money can be used as a match for SRF grants and other federal grant programs. Would this include a CBDG grant?
Yes, yeah. And some SRF programs don't require a match, but some do. It's just that you can use it now for federal programs.
Fantastic. And then folks, I see a lot of people are asking about the meeting recording, and I can definitely tell you that this is being recorded. And if you are attending today, you'll have a link to the recording that's emailed out to you within a few hours of this webinar, and it'll also be posted on efcnetwork.org, and we'll put that in our questions box in a minute. Next, slide 15 indicates default minimum allowance of $10 million. This is for municipal sizes or even very small communities. I think this is just a clarifying question.
Yep, that's for anybody. 10 million across the board. So I think Treasury wanted to make it easier for the folks that had less than 10 million to say, hey, you could just put it all in standard allowance, trying to cut the small systems a break.
All right, and then I think we have time for like maybe one final question. Kimberly, is there one that you'd like to pull out and specifically ask? I want to make sure we have covered everything pretty comprehensively.
I think those are all the ones that I saw. I'm just looking for the uniform guidance link right now. I didn't have that one up yet.
Great. Well, in that case, let's just for our last question, can you just describe a little bit how the Treasury expects to monitor compliance with the rules and regulations?
That is a great question. I don't know exactly. The compliance reports is definitely kind of the first one, making sure people are filling out those reports. And I don't know from there what the Treasury's plans are in terms of ensuring compliance.
Awesome.
I would say also one thing we thought about is not just the Treasury, but also your auditors, how they're looking at how you're using the money and that sort of thing. So that's something to think about as well when you're thinking about how to use these funds and how to treat them. So not just the Treasury, but also your local auditor.
Fantastic. On that note, it's 4:01. So I'll just remind folks to please take our survey that will pop up for you after we close out here. Make sure you take a look at our TA request page and keep an eye out for this recording and our follow-up email, which will include materials related to today's presentation. And then Elsa Marie, I'd like to pass it back to you for closing comments.
Yeah, I just want to thank you all for coming today. As Tess said, we're going to try to respond to some of these questions, but if you have, a really burning question that you're really curious about, feel free to email us directly. My email is mullins, mullins @sog.unc.edu. And also, if we don't know the answer, we'll pass it off to somebody who can. So again, I urge you to capitalize on that flexibility of the standard allowance as you can, and to spread the word to your local government officials. If you're at a state agency, let your small systems know what's going on, to try to, maximize the benefit of these dollars while minimizing the administrative burden.
Great, thank you all so much.